and welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Rail Program Delivery video series. I'm Anthony Thomas, and I'm pleased to introduce Seema Javeri, a general engineer with the FRA.
Hello, everyone.
In this video, we'll discuss the elements involved in developing a cost estimate for a railroad project. Let's get started.
The cost estimating process for FRA-funded or financed projects requires grantees and loan recipients to anticipate the total costs of their projects. This should happen at various stages in the project development process, based on the information available at the time. Sound cost estimates are the foundation of reliable project management and planning. It is important to estimate costs accurately to avoid complications and difficulties in procuring the needed resources for your project.
As a project moves through the project development process, from planning and conceptual design, through preliminary engineering, to final design, the cost estimate gets more detailed as more decisions about the project are made.
In the planning and conceptual design phase, as alternatives are screened out and a single preferred alternative is selected, the cost estimate should have an accuracy of an order of magnitude. That is, knowing if a project will cost in the tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. At this point, decision makers use the cost estimate along with the estimated benefits of the project to determine whether or not to fund the project.
In preliminary engineering, the cost estimate is much more detailed. This is because more is known about the project at this point compared to the cost estimate done in the planning and conceptual design phase. In preliminary engineering, the cost estimate considers the project's track configuration, signal system, stations, utilities, real estate, and the sequence of construction. Because of this detailed information about the project, FRA expects that the cost estimate will not change significantly after preliminary engineering.
Though the estimated cost of the project doesn't change much between preliminary engineering and final design, the level of detail does increase. During this phase, the cost estimate is revised to reflect the project's fully detailed track structures, civil works, signaling, and stations. Using the work breakdown schedule, the estimate is organized by individual projects that together make up the larger project.
Even at the earliest planning stage, cost estimators need a thorough understanding of the project and its conditions in order to produce an accurate, comprehensive, and credible cost estimate. Cost estimators can obtain costs from other project sponsors.
Sponsors can produce useful information from other rail projects, specifically the actual costs that were included in the projects. Otherwise, you may be able to obtain some costs directly from host freight railroads and Surface Transportation Board decision documents.
Now that we know how cost estimates evolve throughout project development, let's talk about the different ways to estimate cost. Three common methodologies are analogy, parametric estimating, and engineering buildup, also known as bottom-up estimating. The method you choose will vary depending on the particular project and the information that you have available.
The analogy method is a comparison between your project and another project that is similar in scope, size, and purpose. Examining a previously completed project and the actual costs that comprise it allows you to make a one-to-one comparison with your project. Ideally, the comparison project should share as many variables with your project as possible. As such, the two projects should be comprised of many of the same elements. The analogy method is quick, inexpensive, and easily understood. However, because truly similar projects are difficult to find, they often rely on only a few points of comparison. This method is generally used at the beginning of a project when little is known.
The parametric estimating method is similar to the analogy method, but instead of comparing costs to one similar project, this method compares actual costs from a number of similar projects. Cost comparisons should be logical, credible, and acceptable to a reasonable person. The level of detail should be appropriate for the stage of project development that you're in and the scope of the project. This method is somewhat more complex because rather than comparing to only one other project, you'll evaluate costs from multiple projects to be able to develop accurate costs for your estimate. This method lends itself best to estimates that are based on dollars per mile or dollars per unit versus lump sum items.
The engineering build-up method, or bottom-up method, requires that the design and specifications of your project are advanced enough to allow you to accurately measure materials and quantities. In this method, you will add up the unit costs of discrete materials, wage rates, and equipment, and multiply each by the quantity needed. It is also important to include fringe benefits, insurances, taxes, and other overhead costs. While this method is the most accurate, it requires that a great deal of detail be known about the project. Furthermore, it is the most time-consuming and expensive method of estimating costs.
Now that we know the different ways to estimate costs, let's walk through the cost estimating requirements for projects receiving FRA grants or loans. The following 3 activities are required: preparing the estimator's methodology memo, developing the estimate, and performing the estimate checks. Let's go through each, beginning with the estimator's methodology memo.
The purpose of this memo is to document the methodology that you'll use when estimating your costs. It helps to ensure that you maintain a consistent project-wide approach, especially if multiple staff members on multiple teams are working on the cost estimate.
The estimator's methodology memo is comprised of 6 sections: Introduction and Project Description, Project Technical Baseline, Estimating Methodologies and Standard Cost Categories, Supporting Assumptions and Ground Rules, Estimate Limitations, and Estimate Checks.
The introduction and project description must describe the current project phase, the level of project development or implementation, and other information to put the estimate in context. The project description should include the project scope, institutional and organizational context, a list of the entities providing administrative or management support, professional services, and construction, the project schedule, including the major phases and the anticipated year of construction, the status of project support and approvals, the status and timing of funding sources, any project cost limits or budget or finance constraints, and the year for which you calculated your base year dollars.
The Project Technical Baseline describes key system characteristics and performance parameters. It includes the project's requirements, namely purpose, technical characteristics, development plan, acquisition strategy and schedule. It states the goal of the project, how, where, and when it will do this, and in the case of railroad projects, how the service will operate.
The Estimating Methodologies and Standard Cost Categories section should describe the estimating methodologies used on the project. It must also describe the structure of the estimate with respect to the standard cost categories. We'll go over the standard cost categories later in this video.
The Supporting Assumptions and Ground Rules section should include information that answers the following questions. What costs are you including in the estimate, and what costs are being excluded? For example, costs covered by other agencies or partners. How are you calculating inflation from costs incurred in the past? How are you calculating inflation for costs that will be incurred in the future? How are you developing contingencies?
The Estimate Limitations section should identify areas in the estimate where there are unknowns and how you will address them. This lends credibility to the cost estimate and makes it more comprehensive and supportable.
At the end of the estimator's methodology memo, you'll include estimate checks and the proposed dates for submitting your revised cost estimates to FRA as project development moves forward. We'll go over estimate checks in more detail in the last part of this video.
While this is a basic overview of the sections that make it up, the cost estimator's memo should include as much detail as possible. It should also accurately portray the planned project. FRA reviews the cost estimator's memo for reasonableness when approving preliminary engineering and final design documentation.
Let's discuss the next step, developing the estimate. In this section, we'll cover the standard cost categories, base year dollars, year of expenditure dollars, and the capital cost database.
One important FRA requirement is the use of the standard cost categories, or the SCC format. The SCC format is an Excel workbook available on the web page on your screen. The purpose of the workbook is to maintain consistency in reporting, estimating, and managing capital costs. The SCC format provides 3 worksheets within it that help cost estimators calculate inflation and conduct a reasonability check. The SCC format allows you to make comparisons among estimates, and it makes it easier to track, evaluate, and control cost changes over time. Often, FRA grantees and loan recipients use the SCC format as the foundation of the structure of the actual estimate. However, you may need to adapt it to your project's unique characteristics.
Due to inflation and the length of time it takes to plan, design, and build rail projects, the buying power of money gets reduced over time. In a cost estimate, costs are generally developed in base year dollars. It is a best practice to inflate costs of past projects to a single base year, generally the current year. Consider an estimate in base year dollars as a concept. It is as if the project could be planned, designed, and built in only 1 year.
To arrive at a total project cost in the year of expenditure dollars, base year costs are distributed over time according to the project schedule and then multiplied by inflation factors for the various elements. You'll repeat this process for each year in the project schedule. The inflation worksheet in the SCC format can help you calculate the costs in year of expenditure dollars.
The Federal Transit Administration launched the Capital Cost Database to provide the cost associated with past heavy rail, light rail, and commuter rail projects. It is structured around the standard cost categories format, which makes it easy to incorporate this information into your cost estimates. The Capital Cost Database is located at the webpage on your screen. Now, let's turn to the last FRA-required cost estimating activity, performing the estimate checks.
An estimate check is an objective review of your cost estimate to ensure that the criteria and requirements have been met and are well documented. This helps to ensure that your estimate is accurate as the design progresses.
FRA requires that the memo include a plan to conduct estimate checks in planning and conceptual design, preliminary engineering, final design, bidding, and construction.
All estimate checks must include the following elements: a verification of project quantities, where you'll make sure the cost estimates include, for example, the correct tunnel length, square footage of major structures, and number of bridges. Parametric cost checks on structures, stations, tunnels, utility relocations, and environmental mitigations. Parametric cost checks are statistical relationships between historical costs and other program variables. Checks for internal consistency, coordination, and reflection of current assumptions, and analysis of contingencies and monitoring of the contingency drawdown.
You can also use a risk review as an estimate check. It should summarize and provide an analysis of a project's uncertainties and risks. It ensures that an appropriate range of costs has been established and forecasted. The risk review also considers options to mitigate risk and should include cost and schedule contingencies.
Although a risk review can be performed at any point in project development, it is typically done before the completion of preliminary engineering. The risk review includes a series of organized exchanges and discussions between the project sponsor and FRA. In these discussions, the group evaluates the project scope, schedule, and cost estimates, identifies and quantifies risks, and decides how to manage these risks. During the risk review process, FRA's oversight contractors forecast the total project cost as an upper bound, an average, and a lower bound through each phase of project development.
As each estimate check is completed, FRA requires cost estimators to submit a revised estimate, a copy of the estimate check, and an explanation of changes since the last submission. That was a lot of information. Let's go through a quick quiz to review some of what you've learned. Question 1. True or false? As you progress through the project development process, the total cost estimate can change, but the level of detail of the estimate remains the same.
False. While the total cost estimate may indeed change as your project progresses, the level of detail of the estimate should increase as more decisions are made about the project.
Question 2. True or false? The only time FRA requires grant and loan recipients to do an estimate check is before the final design phase.
False. FRA requires estimate checks after each of the following phases: planning and conceptual design, preliminary engineering, final design, bidding, and construction.
Question 3. Which of the following is the most helpful in determining cost and year of expenditure dollars? A. The Capital Cost Database. B. The Standard Cost Categories format. C. The Estimator's Methodology Memo. Or D. None of the above.
The correct answer is B, the Standard Cost Categories format. You can find the link to this workbook at the end of the video. Remember that cost estimating is not only an FRA requirement, it is also an integral step in the project development process. With an accurate and thorough cost estimate, you can avoid many problems that may arise on the way to project completion.
For more information about cost estimating, reach out to your FRA regional manager and visit the following web pages. Thank you.